Hello and welcome to Maths on the Move, the podcast from plus.maths.org. I'm Marianne Freiberger. You may have heard that mathematicians think that a doughnut is the same as a coffee cup. And the reason for that is that both shapes have exactly one hole, the doughnut in the middle and the coffee cup inside its handle. And this means that in theory at least, you could deform one of those into the other without tearing the shape or without cutting or gluing anything together. The area of mathematics which thinks of shapes in this way is called topology. And in topology, two shapes are considered the same if you can morph one of them into the other by bending or stretching or squeezing, but without tearing or cutting or gluing. In this podcast, we'll hear from somebody who knows a lot about topology, Mike Hill, the Ordway Professor of Mathematics at the University of Minnesota. We spoke to Mike as he was visiting the Newton Institute to take part in a research program called Equivariant Homotopy Theory in Context. Mike is what is called an algebraic topologist. My colleague Rachel Thomas asked him to tell us what that means.
The basic idea of algebraic topology is I want to understand shapes and geometric objects. I want to understand, in math we call them spaces, but the whole thing is it's an abstraction of geometry. And the key ideas are, can I find features about space or geometric object that are intrinsic to it, that are independent of the way that I'm viewing it? So when I think about a lot of things that I run into, like we're used to sort of familiar 3D objects, but they're also embedded in the world around us. We're used to that space. If I had flexibility to sort of like deform them, maybe I was doing like CAD software and I actually could do this. Is there a way that I could transform one into the other? Is there a way I could try to visualize that, render it in clay, any of these things? And then I want to know, are these things actually distinct? What are tools I can use to justify for myself these are really different in a fundamental way? And they vary from things like, how many pieces are there? Which is actually a really easy and very, I can count the number of chairs here, and that is different than there just being one chair here.
So algebraic topology uses the tools of algebra to define certain properties of shapes, such as the number of pieces that Mike mentioned, or the number of holes in a shape. And these properties are properties that don't change when you stretch or squeeze or bend your topological objects. They're called invariants. So far, so pure mathematics. But algebraic topology has also proved incredibly useful in a very surprising area, helping to make sense of the vast amounts of data gathered in our modern world, big data. This data is often sitting within incredibly high-dimensional spaces, which means that each piece of data has loads and loads of variables, like the thousands of letters in a sequence of an individual DNA genome. Now, in a previous podcast, we talked to Heather Harrington about something called topological data analysis. This uses ideas from algebraic topology to provide deep insights into big data by understanding the shape of the data. We'll put a link to that podcast into the show notes. Now, Mike gave a brilliant Rothschild lecture about these ideas and the surprising places topological data analysis can be used. When Rachel asked Mike to remind us what topological data analysis is, also known as TDA, he started off with a surprising example of a huge data set.
So let me give you a thought experiment. Let's say that I was feeling weirdly ambitious and I found GPS coordinates for every single tree on Earth. And then I just handed you this data set that was GPS coordinates for every tree on Earth. But then when I do this, I'm using GPS coordinates. So if I just gave you this, I've given you a huge data set with fairly large dimensional pieces for each of the points. And that's not necessarily the easiest thing to then work with. I'm giving you a choice of presenting the data. If I worked my way through this and I figured out, then I'd start to, if I graphed this using the way I understand how GPS coordinates work, then I'd start to rebuild a picture of the Earth in that there are no trees below, say, 2 miles. In fact, I don't actually have to go that low beneath the crust, and there are 0 trees.
Yeah.
And then there are also no trees in any of the large bodies of water that cover the Earth. Not just the oceans, but like the seas, all of this. And so if I just had a plot of where all the points are for my various trees, I start to rebuild a lot of the land masses. Not all of them, because I'll see, like, I can't see deserts, I can't see things like this. I'll rebuild, like, where there are bodies of water. I'll also start to rebuild, like, where's there a lot of human interaction, because, you know, we curate trees, but then we also cut down a lot of trees. And so I see a lot about this that's maybe invisible in the way that the data is presented by giving it just by the GPS. One of the ideas that topological data analysis does is computers are really good at actually doing things like counting the number of holes in things. This is the sort of thing that a computer can do. Like, they're sort of built, actually, to do things like this. The way that the processors work, it's exactly computing these kinds of things. And so I can ask this question of, like, what are the invariants of the associated space that this data set lives on?
So as in, what are the invariants of the surface of the Earth that the trees live on?
Exactly.
So even though you haven't sampled specifically points, you've only sampled certain points on the surface of the Earth, and you can rebuild it.
I can start to see, like, what are the things I can see. In this case, it'll tell me a lot about the geometry of the land masses. It won't tell me much beyond, but it will start to tell me, oh, there's like I seem to be sitting on a ball as opposed to just like randomly allocated.
And one of the things I thought was so interesting with the topological data analysis, from what I understand, you start with a bunch of data points, and then you sit little, well, I guess, in my head they're always disks, little circles.
Mine too.
And they start with tiny point-sized circles, and then you gradually increase the size of each circle that sits on each data point.
Yeah.
And what happens, like if you think about your trees, gradually the trees that are in a park will join into one park, or in a country they'll join into one country. Yeah.
Exactly. It fills in as it grows out.
So as Rachel and Mike were discussing, the way TDA works is like this. Imagine you have a lot of data points sitting in space, so they might, for example, indicate the location of trees. You put a little dot on each of those data points, and then you gradually increase the size of the dots you have put on every individual data point. Now, as you increase the size, eventually these little dots will start overlapping. For example, if your data points, aka your trees, were arranged in a circle, then the dots might start overlapping, so what you get is a ring. And then as you increase their size further, they might all start overlapping in the middle as well, and then you get one giant blob. So as you start increasing the size of your little dots, the structures that are formed give you an indication of how the data points are laid out in space. That's sort of the intuition behind TDA, though of course the details are a little more complex than that. Back to Rachel and Mike. And so what sort of insights can you tell us about that process of that it's a process, topological data analysis? It's something that happens over time as you grow these circles on each data point. And what do you see happen, and what can you learn from that process?
So that's a really interesting and deep question that, like, we could spend a lot of time talking about. But the basic idea is it's starting to tell me something about both closeness of the points and then also sort of, in some sense, an aggregated closeness. Like, how do I discover, like, paths between that sort of link as I move my way around? So to unpack that a little more, if the little disks that I'm putting around something are too small, then they don't hit anything. Like, trees generically don't like to be merged with other trees. I mean, we all have. Having said that, everyone's literally, I'm sure, thinking of an example of like a bunch of trees gluing together. But they tend to actually spread themselves out a little. They like to have a little bit of space. I'm ignoring what happens under the soil with the complicated root interactions, but like there's a little bit of space between them. So if my disk were just smaller than sort of the radius of the various trees, then they don't interact. They don't intersect. All I see is basically the same thing I saw with just my collection of data points. A bunch of points just sitting there. Now let's imagine that the little disks I was choosing were the size of the solar system. If I have two disks that are the size of the solar system, I can't tell the difference between one and one that's moved, 10 feet from it. Yeah. Or one that's moved 15,000 miles from it. So it tells me a couple of things. At some point, the fact that they all glue together, this is called the sort of features appearing as they start to glue together. This is called features being born. For sort of an obvious reason, they appeared. And then as the features disappear, because the various blobs that I've built by taking the disks and gluing them all together just sort of merge and the features disappear. Those are called the features dying. And so I talk about a cycle or something having a birth and a death, and then how long it lasts is the extent to which it persists. And things that have a long persistence tend to be describing for me, or the idea is that things are describing sort of a real feature that I should be paying attention to. It's picking out interesting information. Stuff that sort of like appears and then disappears shortly thereafter, this is almost viewed more as like just a kind of noise or like a sampling issue, and I'm not as interested in this sort of thing.
So what kind of examples could you use this kind of technique for? I think you had an example in the talk of looking at the genetic codes for various breast cancers.
Oh, yeah. I love this example. Like, when I saw this, I think I saw Gunnar talk about this, and when I saw it, I was like, oh my God, this is unreal. So what you're referencing is Nicola Levine and Carlson did an analysis of breast cancer. I don't know, 250 some odd breast cancer tumors they analyzed genetically. It ended up being in something like 25,000 dimensional space, so a bunch of data points, difficult to visualize.
Slightly hard to visualize.
Yeah. And so then they did a small amount of manipulation to like reduce that down to something that was about points in something like a 260, 270 dimensional space, still a little tricky to conceptualize. And then using TDA, topological data analysis, they looked at like what are the actual features for this? Like what are the things we're really looking at in this data set? And topological data analysis said, oh, this data set is really sort of like basically 3 roads radiating out of a central point. And in that, it also isolated sort of one cluster that was like, this one is, the data are arranging themselves into this space. It sort of drew it to attention. And that was one that, this is what really drove it all home for me. The people who had tumors of that type had 100% survival rate. They were treatable in a way that was like really, and what was fascinating to me is that what I read about this described it as saying that these tumors were not in any of the traditional breast cancer tumor taxa, that it sort of cleaved against the different ones. It sort of merged, which meant it was its own sort of type that hadn't been the kind people had considered.
So there was some genetic similarity that hadn't been spotted before.
Exactly.
And
it's more a constellation of features.
And actually, it did look like a constellation, like you were saying. So they start with this incredibly high dimensional, even if it's only 260 dimensions, very high dimensional set.
Only
260. And they start with these little discs on each of the points, each of the breast cancer genomes. They grow and features are born and persist and die. And some of the features that came out is this constellation, and there's one constellation in particular that they hadn't picked. That's so amazing that it came out through this new
that they like showed using sort of I found the whole thing fascinating. And also then like potentially life-changing for people.
And then what was really interesting, which really made me want to come to your talk, you said you can use this for looking at questions of social justice.
Oh, yeah.
So how do you use TDA as a way of making sense of
what kind of data are you looking at with social justice that you can use this lens?
So I focus in the talk on voting data. A lot of these, the easiest ways to apply this are to look at things like data that is already tied to sort of geographic features, because we sort of have this ambient space given to us, like where are people voting. People also are using this to study questions of things like segregation, and so it's sort of like looking at people embedded in their environments. For voting, there's sort of two groups that have been really active in this. Mason Porter at UCLA and the students and postdocs working with him. He has a very large group of people who've been working with him, and I just want to advertise their work. It's incredible. This gives me a chance to also mention work of Moon Duchin and the Data and Democracy Lab. They also use TDA. One of the things that Moon and Moon's collaborators have been working on is studying questions of gerrymandering. So in the U.S., there's sort of, it's a representative democracy. So people vote for representatives in certain geographic regions, but those geographic regions are apportioned by the state that you're living in. Gerrymandering is a procedure by which one party puts their finger on the scale by choosing a districting pattern that prioritizes or unfairly advantages their party over the other. They're a great example. Moon's written a number of expository articles about this that you can find on the Data and Democracy website that are really great and sort of have pictures where it's like, look, here's this one party that actually has 60% of the voters, and with this districting plan, they get 1 seat out of 10.
Right.
And it's the kind of thing where you're instantly this doesn't actually feel fair for this.
And the process of using TDA gives you a way to sort of answer those kinds of, or gives you a way to analyze those kinds of questions.
It does, combined with sort of other work that Moons are doing. One of the things that they've found really successful in the working group is to use sort of simulations to sort of build enormous collections of admissible election maps, and then ask what sort of outcomes would you have for these. And then you can look and say, okay, here's this proposed map. Are its outcomes sort of aligned with what we would expect by just looking at a huge randomly generated sample of maps that do this? Are these the outcomes that would make sense for this? And one of the things that they were using TDA for is actually analyzing some of the features to be okay, that's sort of, they were looking at maybe some initially core statistics. Can we get finer statistics using sort of, as I vary the number of districts that say party A wins, and I look at all the ones that, party A wins at least this percentage of votes, then I'm sort of describing the same kind of pattern that TDA analyzes. I vary some parameter, this is playing the role of the size of the disks. Yeah. And then I ask, what sort of shapes am I getting for my
So
my
interesting.
region?
And the idea that, the fact that you can, I think that's the thing I hadn't quite realised until I saw your talk about TDA, the idea that it's like not fine-tuning exam, but you can.
It's like a slider.
You can move your discs from one to the other, so you can move that redistricting from one to the other, so you can really explore how things change as you change that parameter. It's fascinating. And finally, you're here as part of the EHT program, and it's been interesting because you've talked so much about collaboration. What's it been like being here for an extended period of time with a group of people, sort of working on similar areas to you? What's the experience been like?
Oh my gosh, it's wonderful. It's a sort of, it varies from things like, I can sort of wander by and see things that people have written on the board, and I know what they're talking about, so I know the context, and then I'm oh man, I had to talk to so-and-so, because that's really cool, and I have an idea that maybe could help them about this. I've started a bunch of new collaborations with people, some of whom I had never met in person before this program. Most of the senior people that I knew, but like a lot of the earlier career people I hadn't had a chance to meet, especially the European earlier career people. And so it's been great sort of just having a chance to talk to them, to learn about what they're thinking about, to push things that I'm thinking about, to sort of expand into other areas. It's been wonderful.
It's so nice to have the chance, both the time, but also, like you're saying, seeing people in person. It's a different experience.
It really is.
Yeah.
Well, it's I think through the pandemic and how it helped us become more comfortable with Zoom. And I certainly had collaborations that were sort of pandemic collaborations that sort of helped ground me during the otherwise really scary, challenging pandemic period. But it is so different to be in person.
Made me think suddenly little discs on all the people, and you have to make them much bigger.
Exactly, you have to make it much bigger. Exactly. Whereas when we're all in the room,
it's much easier.
You don't have to have that bigger radius.
No.
That was Mike Hill talking to my colleague Rachel Thomas about using topological data analysis not only to understand huge data sets from genetics or voting data, but also to understand why it's nice to all be in the same physical place, which is of course what happens in the research programs that take place at the Newton Institute. We'll put links in the show notes to other content covering the research program that Mike Hill is part of, and also to our other podcast about topological data analysis, where we talked with Heather Harrington. That's it for this podcast. If you've enjoyed it, then please do recommend it to a friend or rate and review the podcast wherever you're listening. It really helps other people find us. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.